quo research was what I was being questioned on, like the idea of qualitative.
Just attended this campfire session here at the Defence Research Network conference, which for me was really interesting. For me, I think one of the key take-home messages was the need for perseverance when applying for research funding, the need for clarity on what your overall aims are and what you're trying to do, but also a real sense of optimism from people who have been there and who have done that in terms of how achievable getting funding can be.
Feel free to reach out and say, hi, I'm just starting out in this.
So in terms of my work, I've been lucky enough to receive funding from the ESRC, both for the PhD, but then most recently for my ESRC Future Research Leaders Award. From this experience, I've got a number of tips that I would give to people, or that I wish I'd known at the time when I was applying for funding. I think my first tip would be to apply quite early on in the process. So for me, I was encouraged to apply in the final year of my PhD, which worked out perfectly. It meant that by the time I'd finished the PhD, because the process can take quite a long time, I had funding in place. So my first tip would be start thinking about funding quite early on, and certainly before you finished your first project. You already need to be thinking about how to get the second one funded. My other point would be, although the process for getting and obtaining funding can seem to take quite a long time, the actual deadlines that you've got for submitting funding proposals and for submitting documents can go by quite quickly. At the University of Exeter, and I think at a lot of other universities too, we have an internal funding process. So a lot of proposals are reviewed internally, and it's then decided which ones go through to external funding. So again, this can take quite a long time, but that's all time that is eating into the overall amount of time available to you to gather together your proposal. So I would also advise to start thinking about it early, but be prepared for quite a tight and quite a quick turnaround when necessary.
They want to see how it works. They want to make it work.
So that money can be used to support events.
One of the key takeaways I'm going to take back today is about the conferences, the positives and negatives of international versus regional or local conferences, about maybe submitting conference papers early on in the planning journey, so that I'm not trying to cram that in at the end of my doctoral journey, as it were. I think that's what I'm going to take away, and that's what we're going to plan in for now. Yes, maybe slightly different in the methods and methodology, but it's good just to start building up that network and seeing that there's other people that are coming up maybe the same issues and problems that you are, and maybe going through the same things. So I think it's a comfort blanket, if you will, that other people are going through the same things, are having that same journey and sharing it with you.
The Defence Research Network is a network for PhD and early career researchers studying defence, security and the armed forces in relation to policy, strategy, culture and society in the social sciences. We're a group that came about after the SWDTP annual conference, where we found a few of us were working perhaps in isolation in our individual institutions, and realised that we could share our experiences and share information about events and books and useful research experiences with each other. So we're looking for anyone from these kind of fields to join us and take part in events, networking events to get together, and also online we have an online group where we can share questions and peer-to-peer sort of advice.
The status within the group wasn't dependent on their academic...
MODREC is the Ministry of Defence Research Ethics Committee. Students need to go through MODREC if they are doing research with human participants, and that is specifically means serving or reservist personnel. So if you're doing interviews with veterans, that may not be a requirement. The Ministry of Defence have a joint service publication which gives you all the real detail about the process and a criteria for whether or not you need to go to MODREC. So that's a good sort of starting point to look at. The MODREC process is more orientated around people doing quantitative research and maybe like medical or more sort of traditional forms. So it's not so used to people going with qualitative research. So that's a bit of a barrier, but there are plenty of people within the Defence Research Network who've been through it, so you can ask advice.
Children in the PhD didn't have any experiences of what I was like as a teacher, what the expectations would be.
takes on average about a year to get through, and it has a number of milestones on the way, such as an initial review and then a sort of scientific committee review. One of the top tips is to take your PhD supervisor along. That'll just give you some reassurance, but also gives the board that you're presenting to the reassurance that your areas and your methods are not, conform with sort of standards within the social sciences area, because a lot of the panel that you're presenting to are professors in respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, etc. So they're not used to this kind of research. So it seems that there's a bit of a disparity between different institutions about whether or not ModRec is required, depending on, for some institutions, they've perhaps got a greater alignment with the Ministry of Defence, and perhaps the university ethics process will be sufficient. Others defer to ModRec. So it's really worth asking a question. There's a secretary to ModRec. You can approach them and share your sort of initial ideas, and it's worth doing that really early on in your PhD, because it's such a lengthy process if you do need to go through it. And that is specifically serving and reservist personnel. So if you're going to interview... The Defence Research Network has people researching everything from armed forces families to cybersecurity, counterinsurgency to the history of air power. If you'd like to join us, please email us on defenceresearchnetwork@gmail.com and follow us on Twitter @DefenceResNet, and you'll be able to join our online forum where you can share experiences and tell us about what your research is and find people with similar methodologies and backgrounds.
Well, as understanding a bit of the kind of internal power dynamics of the organisation and who the people are who actually have some influence, and what their priorities are and how you might be able to relate to them. Because
to me, would be quite important.
The Defence Research Network just ran an informal networking event, and one of our sessions involved a campfire session where all of us shared our experiences of everything from the ModRec to early career questions about qualitative research in defence in particular. One of the binding factors for all of us is that we're each of us, even though we're doing a variety of quite different, disparate topics, we're all of us fitting under the umbrella of defence research in the social sciences. So one of the questions was, how do we make sure that we are relevant? How do we reach out to people that we want to make an impact for? How do we network? These are questions that we, each of us, had something to say, but the Defence Research Network's format was such that these are questions that we can keep coming up and talking about.
That's just the thing that you're going to carry from your master's into your PhD. And I went, and he said, don't. He said, write a book.
So we had experiences to share here today, but we've also got experiences that we can share online. So we hope that you would like to join the network. If you have any questions, fire away, and meet and get to know other people in the field, and, beg the question, ask the hive mind. We look forward to hearing from you.